Hey, welcome back. If you watched last time, you already know how this works. We dim the lights, we set aside whatever comfortable myths we've been carrying around, and we go somewhere real. Somewhere that doesn't look like the movies. Tonight we're going to three places. We're going to the frozen coasts of Scandinavia, where people who history has mostly gotten wrong built ships that shouldn't have worked and sailed to places they had no business reaching. We're going to the greatest trade corridor the ancient world ever assembled, a road that wasn't really a road, connecting China to Rome across 4,000 miles of desert, mountain, and grassland. And we're going to the banks of two rivers in what is now Pakistan, where a civilization larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined built cities with indoor plumbing and standardized weights and measures, and left almost no trace of war, and then simply vanished. We're going to do all of that tonight. Before we begin, if this kind of deep dive history is your reason for staying up past midnight, hit subscribe and leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. I genuinely love reading them. Now turn the lights down, get comfortable. Let's go. Start with what you think you know about Vikings. You think horned helmets, raiders burning monasteries, brutal, illiterate warriors with axes and a death wish, blonde giants who drank mead from skull cups and named themselves things like Bjorn Ironside, big, simple, violent people from the far north who terrorized the civilized world for a few centuries and then mercifully stopped. This is approximately as accurate as a map drawn by someone who has heard a rough description of a place but has never been there. Some of the landmarks are in roughly the right location. The overall picture is badly wrong. The historical reality of the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 AD, is more interesting, more complicated, more geographically enormous, and in several key respects more admirable than anything popular culture has served you. The people we call Vikings were not a single people, not a unified culture, not even primarily raiders. They were merchants, explorers, colonists, craftspeople, poets, lawmakers, and farmers who happened to have also developed the most advanced shipbuilding technology in the early medieval world, and used it to go further, faster, and more successfully than anyone before them. They also raided. That part is true, but it is perhaps the least interesting thing about them. First, where did they come from and why then? Scandinavia in the late 8th century was divided among numerous small polities, none of them unified, all of them operating in a landscape of thin agricultural soil, dense forest, deeply indented coastlines, and long dark winters. The people who lived there, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes in rough geographic distribution, had been farming this difficult land for thousands of years, and had developed maritime skills out of sheer necessity. When your land is divided by fjords and your neighbors are accessible more easily by water than by land, you build boats. When your growing season is short and your soil is rocky, you look for additional resources wherever you can find them. By the late 8th century, several conditions converged to push Scandinavians outward. Population growth had made good agricultural land scarce. The political consolidation happening across Scandinavia, as petty kingdoms were absorbed into larger ones, created losers, younger sons with no inheritance, warriors who had backed the wrong political side, free farmers whose land had been absorbed into a lord's estate. The political losers of Scandinavian consolidation were among the people who got on ships. At the same time, they had the ships. The Viking longship is genuinely one of the great technological achievements of the early medieval world, and it deserves a moment of proper appreciation before we do anything else. A Viking longship was clinker-built, meaning its hull planks overlapped each other like clapboard siding on a house, a technique that created a flexible hull that could flex in heavy seas rather than shattering, absorbing the impact of waves through movement rather than rigidity. This flexibility was the key to its performance. Modern replicas that have been built and sailed confirmed that Viking ships could handle open ocean conditions that would have defeated the heavier, more rigid vessels of Mediterranean tradition. The longship was shallow-drafted, often only half a meter of hull below the waterline, which meant it could be sailed directly onto beaches rather than requiring a harbor, and could be rowed up rivers that deeper-hulled vessels couldn't enter. It was light enough to be portaged, carried overland between river systems. It was symmetric, capable of rowing in either direction without turning around. It could be sailed or rowed, giving it flexibility when wind was absent or in the wrong direction. And it was fast. A Viking longship under favorable wind could make 200 miles in a day. Nothing else on the early medieval ocean could match it. This ship was the instrument of the Viking Age. Everything that followed was built on it. The raid that history marks as the beginning of the Viking Age struck the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England, on June 8, 793 AD. Lindisfarne was not chosen randomly. It was a famous, wealthy monastery, a center of Christian scholarship and art, the place where the Lindisfarne Gospels had been produced, an illuminated manuscript of extraordinary beauty that is still considered one of the masterpieces of early medieval art. It was also, from a raider's practical perspective, located on a small island with no defenses, containing large amounts of valuable portable wealth in the form of gold and silver ecclesiastical objects, and populated by people whose vocation did not include armed resistance. The raiders arrived without warning in ships that the watching monks had never seen before. They killed some, enslaved others, stripped the monastery of its valuables and left. The entire operation probably took hours. The Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne where he served as an advisor, described the raid in horrified terms and asked what it meant that pagans had been allowed to desecrate the holiest ground in England. His horror was entirely genuine and also slightly misplaced in its analysis. The Vikings weren't primarily motivated by anti-Christian theology. They were motivated by the practical observation that monasteries were full of portable wealth and empty of soldiers. The raid on Lindisfarne inaugurated roughly 2.5 centuries in which Viking raiders struck coastal and river-accessible targets across the British Isles, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and North Africa. They raided Paris repeatedly. They sacked Seville. They ranged into the Mediterranean and raided as far as the Italian coast. They established the Danelaw in England, a large territory under Scandinavian political control. They settled Normandy, whose subsequent Duke, William, would conquer England in 1066 in an invasion led by the descendants of Vikings who had settled in France. The raiding was real and the disruption was significant, but it was one facet of Viking activity, and arguably not the most significant one. While Norwegian and Danish Vikings were hitting the coasts of Western Europe, Swedish Vikings were going east. The Swedish Vikings, known in the historical sources as Rus or Varangians, moved through the river systems of Eastern Europe in a direction that led not to English monasteries, but to something more valuable: the trade routes connecting the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. The river geography of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine forms a connected network linking the Baltic coast to the Black Sea via the Dnieper River and to the Caspian Sea via the Volga. This network was the Varangian Highway, and the Swedes used it with the same combination of commercial acuity and occasional violence that characterized Viking activity everywhere. They established trading posts, some of which became cities: Novgorod, Kiev, Smolensk. The Rus state that eventually became the foundation of medieval Russia was, in its origins, a Scandinavian merchant warrior enterprise that gradually merged with the Slavic populations it settled among. The name Russia itself likely derives from the Norse word for rowers, Rus. The Volga trade route connected Scandinavian merchants to the silver of the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, with its center in Baghdad, needed the furs, amber, and enslaved people that the North could supply, and paid in silver dirhams. Hoards of Islamic silver coins have been found throughout Scandinavia, some consisting of thousands of coins, testimony to the scale and profitability of this Eastern commerce. A Viking merchant who made the journey to the markets of Bulgar on the Volga, or even to Constantinople, was operating in a trading network that spanned from the Arctic Ocean to the Persian Gulf. The Arab geographer Ibn Fadlan encountered a group of Rus merchants on the Volga in 921 AD and left one of the most detailed eyewitness descriptions of Vikings in the historical record. He was not entirely complimentary. He described them as filthy in their personal habits, noting that they all washed from a single communal basin without rinsing it between uses. He described their physical appearance. Tall, with bodies like palm trees, he wrote, fair-skinned and tattooed with dark blue patterns from fingernails to necks. He described their religious practices and their commercial customs and their ship funerals, which involved placing the deceased on the ship along with possessions, sacrificed animals, and in this case, a sacrificed slave woman, then burning the whole assembly. Ibn Fadlan was a sophisticated observer from a sophisticated civilization, writing about people very different from himself. His account is invaluable and also shaped by his own cultural perspective. The Vikings he encountered were alien to him and fascinating and repellent in roughly equal measure. They were, from his perspective, powerful and commercially capable and religiously incomprehensible and personally revolting. They were, from their own perspective, doing business. Now the horned helmets. No, they didn't wear horned helmets. This is one of those historical misconceptions so deeply embedded in popular imagination that corrections feel like gaslighting, but the evidence is unambiguous. Viking warriors wore conical iron helmets, sometimes with a nose guard, sometimes with a mail curtain protecting the neck and cheeks. These are the helmets found in Viking burials and depicted in contemporary art. The one famous example of a Viking-era Scandinavian helmet found at Germanbu in Norway in 1943 has no horns. No horns appear on helmets in Viking-age art depicting warriors. Horned helmets did exist in Scandinavia, but they date to the Bronze Age, more than 1,000 years before the Viking Age, and appear to have had ceremonial rather than military functions. They are magnificent objects, genuinely imposing, and completely unrelated to the raiding parties of the 9th and 10th centuries. The horned helmet image was essentially invented in the 19th century, popularized by Romantic-era artists and composers, most notably the costume designer for Richard Wagner's opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen, which premiered in 1876 and featured a spectacular horn-helmeted aesthetic that cemented the image in popular consciousness. Wagner's Vikings wore horns. Then every subsequent theatrical and eventually cinematic Viking wore horns. And the myth became the reality in public imagination. Correcting this does nothing to make the Vikings less interesting. They were plenty interesting without the headgear assistance. The Norse sagas. Here is where the Vikings become genuinely astonishing, in a way that has nothing to do with violence. The Norse literary tradition is one of the great bodies of medieval literature. The sagas, prose narratives written down in Iceland primarily in the 13th century, but drawing on oral traditions and historical events of the Viking Age, represent a literary achievement of remarkable sophistication. They are written in a spare, understated prose style that modern readers often describe as feeling surprisingly contemporary. Characters are described through their actions and through what other characters say about them rather than through authorial analysis. Violence is narrated with a matter-of-fact economy that has the quality of shock. Motivation is shown rather than explained. The Icelandic sagas tell stories of family feuds and legal disputes, of exploration and settlement, of political conflict and personal honor, of love and revenge, and the complicated relationship between old religious traditions and the new Christianity that was spreading into Scandinavia during the Viking Age. They are full of specific geographical detail, specific genealogical information, and a feel for the physical reality of life in a cold, hard landscape that gives them an immediacy across nearly 1,000 years. Ingjald's saga, perhaps the greatest of the family sagas, follows a 50-year blood feud between two Icelandic families with a narrative complexity and moral depth that would not embarrass a contemporary novelist. Egil's saga follows the life of a poet-warrior whose psychological portrait is so specific and vivid that some scholars have proposed he had Paget's disease based on the description of his skull. The Vinland sagas, the sagas of Eric the Red and Leif Erikson, describe the Norse discovery and attempted settlement of North America, an account dismissed for centuries as legend and then vindicated by archaeology. Vinland. This one deserves special attention because it is one of those moments where the archaeological record and the historical record aligned in a way that changed what we thought we knew about history. The sagas describe the Norse discovery of a land to the west of Greenland, called Vinland, around the year 1000 AD, roughly 500 years before Columbus. The accounts describe the landscape, the resources found there, the encounters with indigenous people called Skraelings, and the eventual abandonment of the settlement after conflicts made it untenable. For centuries, this was treated as either legend or exaggeration. North America before Columbus was a European discovery. The sagas were Norse mythology dressed up as history. Then in 1960, the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, acting on a tip from a local fisherman, began excavating a site at Elance Ox Meadows on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland in Canada. What they found beneath the turf were the foundations of Norse buildings. Long houses built in exactly the style documented at Norse sites in Greenland and Iceland, a smithy with an iron smithing hearth, iron boat rivets, a bronze cloak pin of Norse design, and other artifacts that could only have come from Scandinavia. Elance Ox Meadows, confirmed by radiocarbon dating to approximately 1000 AD, is the earliest confirmed European presence in the Americas. The Vikings were in North America 5 centuries before Columbus, and the sagas that described it were not legend. They were history. The settlement at Elance Ox Meadows appears to have been a base camp rather than a permanent colony, used for a few decades at most before being abandoned. The conflict with the indigenous population described in the sagas as the primary reason for leaving appears to have been real. The Norse were vastly outnumbered and unable to maintain a settlement against sustained opposition. The attempt to colonize the Americas in 1000 AD failed because of a simple numerical reality. The Norse did not have the population, the supply chain, or the military capacity to establish themselves against the existing inhabitants. Columbus's voyage in 1492 succeeded in inaugurating sustained European contact, not because it was braver or more skilled than Leif Erikson's, but because it happened at a moment when European states had the resources, the motivation, and the organizational capacity to follow up a discovery with sustained colonization. The timing, not the achievement, was the difference. Norse religion, which we call Norse mythology because it's no longer practiced as a living faith, was a cosmological system of genuine complexity and darkness. The Norse universe was Yggdrasil, the world tree, an enormous ash tree whose branches spread across the 9 worlds, whose roots reached into wells of wisdom, fate, and death. Odin, the chief of the Aesir gods, sacrificed himself to himself, hanging from Yggdrasil for 9 days, pierced by his own spear in order to gain the wisdom of the runes. He sacrificed one eye to drink from the well of wisdom. He sent his ravens Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, out across the world every day to bring back information. He was the god of war and death and poetry and wisdom, the All-Father and the master of Sather magic and the chooser of the slain. But he was also a trickster and a wanderer who appeared in disguise among humans, testing them. Thor, whose name is embedded in Thursday, was the red-bearded hammer-wielder, the protector of humanity, the slayer of giants, beloved of common people in a way that the more aristocratic Odin was not. Freya was the goddess of love and also of war, the first practitioner of Sather magic among the gods, who received half of all battle slain into her hall Folkvanger, while Odin received the other half in Valhalla. Loki was the shape-shifting trickster, neither fully god nor fully giant, whose nature was fundamentally ambiguous, alternately helping and hindering the gods, whose ultimate role was to survive until Ragnarok and lead the forces of chaos against the ordered cosmos. Ragnarok itself, the Norse apocalypse, was not quite like the apocalyptic traditions of other cultures. It was fated, known in advance, unavoidable. The gods knew it was coming. Odin's entire strategy of gathering slain warriors in Valhalla was preparation for the final battle in which he and his army would fight and lose. The world would be destroyed, and then it would be born again, rising from the sea, and the surviving gods and humans would begin again. This cosmological framework, with its emphasis on fate and the dignity of facing inevitable doom with courage, is the philosophical context for the famous Viking ideals of battlefield courage. Not the nihilistic death-seeking of Hollywood cliché, but something more nuanced. You could not avoid your fate. What you could control was how you met it. The end of the Viking Age is conventionally placed at 1066, which is a tidy date attached to two events in the same year. In September, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada invaded northern England and was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the English king Harold Godwinson. In October, a fleet landed in the south of England. William, Duke of Normandy, a man who was himself the great-great-great-grandson of a Viking who had settled in France, defeating and killing Harold at the Battle of Hastings and conquering England. The irony is almost too perfect. The Viking Age ended partly because a Viking's descendant conquered its last target. But the end was also a function of transformation rather than defeat. The populations of Scandinavia had been incorporating Christianity since the late 10th century, a process driven by both genuine religious conversion and the political calculation of Scandinavian kings who found that Christian ecclesiastical organization made governing large territories more manageable. Christianized Scandinavia was not Viking Scandinavia. The monasteries that had been targets became institutions. The trading networks became commercial relationships between recognized states rather than between raiders and victims. The settlers in England, Ireland, Normandy, Sicily, and Russia had assimilated into their surrounding populations. The Vikings didn't stop. They became someone else. And what they had built, the trade networks, the legal traditions, the settlement patterns, the literature, the seamanship, endured in the cultures they had created and entered. Part 2. The Silk Road, the world's first superhighway. It was not a road. This matters, and we should say it clearly before anything else. The Silk Road was not a single defined route, was not paved, was not called the Silk Road by the people who traveled it, and was not primarily about silk. The term itself was invented by a 19th-century German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, and it has stuck because it evokes exactly the kind of romantic, exotic image that the actual trade routes also evoke, but in a much tidier form than reality allows. The actual Silk Road was a shifting, branching, seasonal network of routes crossing roughly 4,000 miles of the most geographically challenging terrain on Earth, from the Chinese imperial capitals of Chang'an and Luoyang in the east to the ports and cities of the Mediterranean in the west, with innumerable branches and variants running through Central Asia, Persia, India, Arabia, and the steppes north of the main corridors. It was not maintained by any single authority. It was not mapped comprehensively by anyone who traveled it. It had no single peak period of activity. It was in use, in various configurations, for roughly 1,500 years, from around 200 BC to the 15th century AD, and it transformed during that period as the empires and states along its length rose and fell and were replaced. Goods that traveled it included silk, yes, but also paper, printing technology, gunpowder, the compass, cotton textiles, spices, glassware, metalwork, gemstones, horses, drugs, foodstuffs, and above all ideas. Mathematical concepts, religious traditions, artistic styles, medical knowledge, plague-causing bacteria, and the accumulated intellectual output of every civilization the roots connected. More things of enduring consequence traveled the Silk Road as ideas than ever traveled it as goods. And the people who traveled it were not solitary heroic merchants making the entire journey from China to Rome. Almost no one did the whole route. Goods passed hand to hand through a chain of middlemen, Chinese traders to Central Asian merchants, who sold to Persian intermediaries, who passed goods to Arab traders, who sold to Byzantine merchants, who connected to Mediterranean distribution networks. The price of silk in Rome reflected the markup of every transaction in the chain. This is the real Silk Road, not a romance but a business, operated by practical people solving practical problems across landscapes that were trying to kill them. Begin where the roots began, in China. The Han Dynasty, which governed China from 206 BC to 220 AD, was the political engine that initiated what we now call the Silk Road in its earliest recognizable form. The Han Emperor Han Wudi, who reigned from 141 to 87 BC, was concerned primarily with the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic peoples to the north of China who had been raiding Chinese territory with enough regularity to be a genuine strategic problem. His solution involved both military campaigns and diplomacy, and the diplomacy required missions to the west to identify potential allies. The most famous of these diplomatic missions was led by Zhang Qian, dispatched by Han Wudi in 138 BC with a party of 100 men to find the Yuezhi people, a nomadic group that had been displaced westward by the Xiongnu and might be interested in an alliance against a common enemy. Zhang Qian's mission was an immediate diplomatic failure. He was captured by the Xiongnu almost immediately and held for 10 years before escaping, and the Yuezhi, when he finally reached them, had found a comfortable new home and had no interest in returning east to fight the Xiongnu. But the mission was a colossal strategic success in a way that nobody had anticipated. Zhang Qian returned to China with detailed information about the lands to the west, peoples and places that Chinese geographical knowledge had not previously documented with any accuracy. He described Fergana, famous for its fast horses. He described Bactria, the Greek-influenced kingdom in what is now Afghanistan. He described Parthia, the empire in what is now Iran. He reported that in the markets of Bactria he had seen goods from China, bamboo and textiles, that had arrived there via India, suggesting the existence of trade connections running through routes that Chinese officials had not systematically exploited. Han Wudi's response was to send further missions westward, both diplomatic and commercial, and to fight a series of military campaigns to control the Tarim Basin, the string of oasis cities along the edge of the Taklamakan Desert in what is now Xinjiang in western China. Control of these oases was control of the first segment of the Silk Road, the access point through which goods left China heading west. The Tarim Basin oases sit in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name in the Uyghur language means approximately you go in and you don't come out, is a vast expanse of sand dunes and salt pans with virtually no water and summer temperatures that can exceed 40 degrees Celsius. The oasis cities on its northern and southern edges, Dunhuang, Khotan, Kashgar, Kucha, Turfan, derived their existence from rivers fed by snowmelt from the surrounding mountain ranges, the Tian Shan to the north and the Kunlun to the south. Each oasis was essentially a self-contained agricultural and commercial system, growing food, producing craft goods, and maintaining the infrastructure for the caravans passing through. Getting past the Taklamakan, either on the northern or southern route around its edge, brought you to the Pamirs, the knot of mountain ranges where the Himalayas, Karakoram, Hindu Kush, and Tian Shan all converge, rising to altitudes of over 4,000 meters on the main passes. Crossing the Pamirs was a serious undertaking at any time of year and was genuinely lethal in winter or in bad weather. The passes were often blocked for months. Caravans timed their movements carefully, and still sometimes got caught by early storms. Past the Pamirs, you entered the Central Asian world, the great cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, the steppes of what is now Kazakhstan, the Fergana Valley, the Oxus River. Beyond that, Persia. Beyond Persia, the Levant and its connections to the Mediterranean. The physical geography of the Silk Road was the first and most constant challenge every traveler faced, and understanding it explains decisions that would otherwise seem puzzling. Why goods changed hands so many times, why specific cities became enormously wealthy as transit points, why control of certain passes was worth fighting major wars over. The goods. Silk is where we begin because silk is the product of China that was most prized in the West, and it was prized for reasons that combined genuine aesthetic appeal with something more interesting: mystery. Chinese silk technology, the knowledge of how to cultivate silkworms, process their cocoons, and spin and weave the resulting fiber, was a state secret protected with something approaching genuine paranoia. The penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of China was death. Western recipients of Chinese silk knew only that it was a cloth of extraordinary fineness, with a sheen and lightness unlike anything produced in the Mediterranean world, and that it came from somewhere very far to the east. Various theories about its origin circulated in Rome. Pliny the Elder believed it was combed from the leaves of trees by the Seers people, which is a reasonable error given that silk comes from the cocoons of caterpillars that eat mulberry leaves. Silk reached Rome in quantity during the late Republic and early Empire, and it was both enormously expensive and enormously popular among the wealthy. Roman moralists complained about its cost draining silver out of the empire, and also about the immodesty of Roman women wearing garments so fine as to be nearly transparent. Seneca wrote that you could hardly call such fabric clothing, since it concealed nothing. The combination of expense and slight scandal made silk the perfect luxury good, and demand was high enough that it justified the entire commercial infrastructure connecting China to the Mediterranean. Beyond silk, China exported porcelain of a quality that Western craftspeople could not match for most of the Silk Road period: iron of consistent high quality, and bronze objects. In the other direction, the goods flowing eastward toward China included glassware, particularly the fine-blown glass of Roman and later Byzantine and Islamic craftsmen, textiles of wool and linen, coral from the Mediterranean, amber from the Baltic filtered through multiple trade networks, horses from Fergana and later from Arabia, cotton from India, and spices from Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean trade network. The horses deserve a particular mention, because they were not simply a trade good but a strategic commodity. Chinese horses were smaller and less suited to the heavy cavalry tactics that became increasingly important in Central Asian warfare. The Fergana horses, described in Chinese records as heavenly horses and said to sweat blood, which was probably a poetic description of a real phenomenon related to a parasitic skin infection common in the region, were exactly what Chinese military strategists wanted. Han Wudi fought actual wars to secure access to them. The trade in war horses between Central Asia and China was one of the most consistently important economic relationships along the Silk Road's entire length. The people. If goods moved hand to hand through the Silk Road's chain of middlemen, who were the links in that chain? The Sogdians deserve more recognition than they typically receive in popular histories of the Silk Road. They were an Iranian-speaking people from the region around Samarkand and Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan, and from roughly the 3rd century to the 10th century AD, they were the dominant commercial intermediaries of Central Asian trade. Sogdian merchant networks stretched from China to Persia, with trading colonies established in major cities along the routes. Sogdian letters discovered at a watchtower in Dunhuang, dated to around 313 AD, provide one of our most intimate glimpses of life on the Silk Road. Written by merchants and travelers, they describe prices, debts, family situations, and the frustrations of distance from home, with a specificity that makes the writers feel immediately present across 17 centuries. One letter from a woman named Nanai Dihat to her mother describes how her husband has abandoned her in Dunhuang while he travels east for business, that she is living in difficult circumstances, and that she regrets not having followed her mother's advice about not coming so far from home. The letter was never sent. It was found in the watchtower where it had been left, still bundled with other letters for dispatch, for 1700 years. The voice in it is completely clear. The Sogdians were succeeded in commercial dominance along the routes by Arab merchants following the rise of Islam, and then by Persian merchants operating within the Islamic world, and then during the Mongol period by a new wave of long-distance travelers operating under the Pax Mongolica, the enforced peace of the Mongol Empire that made it briefly possible to travel from China to Persia with something approaching safety. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant whose account of his travels to China between 1271 and 1295 is the most famous European travel narrative of the Silk Road era, was traveling during the peak of the Mongol period. His account of Kublai Khan's court at Khanbalik, present-day Beijing, of the wealth of Chinese cities, and of the commercial systems of Asia was so extraordinary to European readers that many dismissed it as fiction. The nickname given to him in Venice, Il Milione, Mr. Million, was a sardonic comment on his alleged exaggerations. Modern scholarship has consistently found that Marco Polo's account is fundamentally accurate in its major claims and impressively detailed in many of its specifics. The cities he described existed. The commercial systems he described operated essentially as he said. He may have embellished some details and probably compressed or conflated others, but he was not inventing. The unbelievable thing was simply that China in the 13th century was wealthier, larger, more technically sophisticated, and more commercially advanced than anything European readers could reference from their own experience. Religion. The Silk Road was the greatest vector for religious transmission in the ancient and medieval world. Every major religious tradition that became significant across the Eurasian landmass traveled it in some form, in some direction, at some point. Buddhism spread from its origins in northern India to become the dominant religion of Central Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, primarily through the Silk Road network. The first Buddhist texts arrived in China during the Han Dynasty, brought by merchants and monks from Central Asia. Buddhist monasteries established along the Silk Road routes served simultaneously as religious centers, hostels for travelers, and nodes in the commercial network. They provided rest, protection, food, and spiritual services to caravans in exchange for donations that funded their own operations. The Magao Caves at Dunhuang, a complex of Buddhist cave temples carved into a cliff face at the eastern end of the Taklamakan Desert, preserve some of the most extraordinary collections of Buddhist art in the world, accumulated over 1,000 years of patronage by merchants and pilgrims grateful for safe passage through the desert. The Chinese monk Xuanzang, who traveled from China to India and back between 629 and 645 AD in search of original Buddhist scriptures, left one of the most detailed travel accounts of the Central Asian Silk Road. His journey took 17 years and covered tens of thousands of kilometers. He brought back hundreds of Buddhist texts and spent the rest of his life translating them. His journey became the inspiration for the 16th-century Chinese novel Journey to the West, one of the most beloved works in Chinese literary tradition. Islam spread along the same routes in the opposite direction after the 7th century, carried by Arab and Persian merchants into Central Asia, where it encountered and largely replaced the Buddhist traditions that the Silk Road had previously spread. Nestorian Christianity, a theological tradition declared heretical by the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD, found refuge east of Byzantium and traveled along the Silk Road to establish communities as far as China, where a Nestorian stele in Xi'an, carved in 781 AD and discovered in 1625, records the history of the Nestorian community in the Tang capital. Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, and Judaism all traveled the routes and established communities along them. The Silk Road was, among all its other functions, the greatest engine of religious pluralism the ancient world produced. A merchant in Samarkand in the 8th century might have Buddhist neighbors, Zoroastrian business partners, and Muslim customers, and might himself practice a syncretic blend of traditions that borrowed elements from several of the above. This pluralism was not born of abstract tolerance, but of commercial practicality. When you need to do business with people whose beliefs differ from yours, you find ways to coexist. The Silk Road cities were generally tolerant of religious difference in the pragmatic way that depends not on principle but on profit, and the result was a degree of religious diversity that later periods of religious nationalism deliberately dismantled. The technology. This is where the Silk Road's importance becomes most clear, and also most underappreciated. Paper was invented in China during the Han Dynasty and spread westward along the Silk Road, reaching the Islamic world in the 8th century when Chinese papermakers captured after the Battle of Talas in 751 AD passed their knowledge to their captors. The Islamic world embraced paper with enthusiasm, establishing paper mills from Central Asia to Spain. Paper reached Europe through the Islamic world in the high medieval period. The history of literacy, scholarship, and eventually the printing press is inseparable from the spread of paper-making technology along the Silk Road. Printing technology, also developed in China, spread westward along similar routes, though more slowly and in forms that required transformation for the alphabetic scripts of the West. The Chinese innovations of woodblock printing and eventually movable type printing predated Gutenberg's 1440s printing press by several centuries. And while the specific connection between Chinese printing and European printing technology remains debated by historians, the conceptual framework of printing clearly traveled westward before it was independently developed in Europe. Gunpowder, developed by Chinese alchemists seeking an elixir of immortality and finding, instead the explosive combination of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, traveled westward through the Islamic world, reaching Europe in the 13th century in forms that gradually transformed warfare across the continent. The consequences are still unfolding. The zero, without which modern mathematics is essentially impossible, developed in India and traveled both east to China and west through Persia to the Islamic world, and then to Europe, where the Hindu-Arabic numeral system replaced the Roman numeral system in a transformation that made complex calculation vastly more practical. Medieval European scholars called the new numbers algorithm, a Latinized form of the name of the Central Asian mathematician Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, whose treatises on Indian mathematics reached Europe via the Silk Road intellectual network. The list continues. The techniques of irrigation, of textile production, of agricultural crops that moved between regions, of medical knowledge including the Greek medical tradition that was preserved and extended by Islamic scholars and eventually returned to Europe, of musical instruments and musical scales, of astronomical knowledge. The Silk Road was a mechanism for the diffusion of human knowledge across the Eurasian landmass, And the world we live in is the accumulated result of what happened when the ideas of China, India, Persia, the Arab world, and Europe spent 15 centuries in conversation. The plague. We discussed the Black Death in the previous episode, but its relationship to the Silk Road demands a specific mention here, because it is the dark side of everything that made the roots so consequential. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused the Black Death, was endemic in rodent populations in Central Asia, particularly in the region of the steppes and the Tian Shan foothills. It had probably been present there for centuries before it became pandemic. What the Mongol conquests of the 13th century and the subsequent Pax Mongolica appear to have done was accelerate its spread along the Silk Road network by increasing the volume and speed of human and animal movement along routes that pass through the bacterium's endemic range. The trade network that had distributed paper, printing, silk, spices, religious ideas, mathematical concepts, and artistic styles for 15 centuries was the same network that distributed Yersinia pestis to the Black Sea ports in the 1340s, and from there to the Mediterranean, and from there to Western Europe. The benefits and the catastrophes of connection traveled the same roads. This is perhaps the most important thing the Silk Road teaches us about globalization, the ancient version or any other. Connection increases the velocity at which everything moves. Goods, ideas, technologies, art, religion, and also disease, violence, disruption, and the unintended consequences of contact between populations with no shared history of the pathogens and cultural disruptions the other carries. The Black Death was a catastrophe. It was also a consequence of the same network that had spent 15 centuries making the civilizations it connected richer, more sophisticated, and more capable. Both things are true simultaneously. The Silk Road is not a story of simple progress. It is a story of consequence, and consequence is never entirely under anyone's control. The Silk Road's decline was not a single event, but a gradual reorientation. The Mongol period, the 14th century, which brought both the peak of overland connectivity and the Black Death, also brought the political fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into competing successor states that were less uniformly hospitable to the long-distance merchants who had operated under Mongol protection. The Ming dynasty in China, which replaced the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1368, turned deliberately inward, reducing the outward commercial engagement that had characterized the Tang and Song dynasties at their most expansive. But the decisive shift was nautical. Portuguese navigators, sponsored by Prince Henry and his successors, spent the 15th century systematically exploring the African coast, seeking a sea route to Asia that would bypass the Islamic intermediaries who controlled the overland routes and extracted profit at every step. In 1498, Vasco da Gama's fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached Calicut in India. In 1511, the Portuguese captured Malacca, the key entrepot of Southeast Asian trade. By 1513, Portuguese ships were in Chinese waters. The sea route to Asia was open. The ocean connection, once established, was faster, cheaper, and capable of carrying vastly larger volumes of goods than any caravan network. Overland trade did not stop, but it lost its primacy. The Silk Road cities, which had for centuries derived their wealth from their position on the routes, found themselves off the new main line of global commerce. Samarkand, the great city that Timur had made his imperial capital in the late 14th century, and adorned with some of the most magnificent architecture in the Islamic world, became a backwater within a century of his death. Kashgar and Cotton and the other Tarim Basin oases continued to exist, but faded from the center of world history. The wealth that had flowed through Central Asia for 15 centuries now flowed across the Indian Ocean. What the Silk Road was. It was not a road. It was a system for moving things, people, and ideas across the largest landmass on Earth, built out of individual acts of commerce and curiosity and ambition and desperation, and religious conviction and intellectual restlessness, sustained over 15 centuries by the basic human observation that somewhere over there is something valuable, and there must be a way to get it. It built cities that still exist and cities that are now only ruins under the sand. It connected civilizations that had no other means of contact. It made some people fantastically wealthy and killed others in the desert or the mountains or at the hands of bandits. It spread every great religious tradition of the ancient world to populations who had never heard of it. It spread the concepts without which modern mathematics cannot function. It spread the technology without which modern literacy cannot be imagined. And it spread the bacterium that killed a third of Europe. This is what connection looks like. This is what it has always looked like. The Silk Road is not a parable about the simple benefits of globalization or a warning about its simple dangers. It is an honest record of what happens when the world becomes smaller, and the record is simultaneously astonishing and cautionary, inspiring and horrifying. A story of everything that humanity is capable of and everything that it cannot control. We are still on the Silk Road in a sense. The cables under the ocean carry its traffic now. The container ships have replaced the camel caravans. The things we exchange are different and the distances are shorter in time if not in space. But the basic dynamic has not changed. Somewhere over there is something valuable. There must be a way to get it. And whatever comes back along the route will be more than what we sent. Part 3. The Indus Valley, the civilization that built perfection and disappeared. Here is the mystery. Sometime around 2600 BC, in the broad river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, something happened that modern scholars are still struggling to fully understand. A civilization built cities. Not the first cities in the world. Mesopotamia had been urbanizing for centuries, and Egypt had its own traditions of monumental organization. But these cities were different from anything else being built at the same time, or for a long time afterward. They were planned, not improvised, not organically grown from a village that kept expanding, not organized around a palace or a temple that the rest of the settlement accumulated around. Planned from the beginning on a grid, straight streets, standard-sized fired bricks, drainage systems built into the fabric of the city from its foundations, public wells at regular intervals, houses with indoor bathrooms connected to covered drainage channels running beneath the streets. The largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro on the Indus River in what is now Sindh province in Pakistan, and Harappa on the Ravi River in Punjab, were large by the standards of the ancient world. Mohenjo-Daro probably held between 40 and 80,000 people at its peak, making it one of the most populous cities on Earth in 2500 BC. And almost nothing about how they were governed, what they believed, who led them, or what language they spoke is currently understood by anyone. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization after the first site discovered, was found by modern archaeologists starting in the 1920s, and the story of its discovery is itself interesting. Archaeological work in what was then British India had been ongoing for decades, but the possibility of a major prehistoric civilization predating the Vedic period was not on anyone's scholarly agenda in 1920. The surveys that led to the discovery of Harappa were partly triggered by a practical observation. Railway construction teams laying tracks in Punjab were using bricks from ancient ruins as ballast, and the bricks were unusually large, uniform, and hard-fired, qualities that suggested they were not natural objects. When archaeologists investigated, they found themselves looking at a city of extraordinary antiquity. The excavation of Mohenjo-Daro, led by the British archaeologist John Marshall and later by Ernest Mackay and others, revealed a city so sophisticated in its planning that the early excavators initially assumed they must be looking at something much more recent. The drainage system alone was unprecedented. Covered stone drains running beneath the major streets, connected to house drains, carrying wastewater away from the settlement in a system more sophisticated than anything in the contemporary Near East, and for that matter, more sophisticated than anything in medieval Europe several thousand years later. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a large rectangular pool of watertight brick construction set in a courtyard, lined with bitumen to make it impermeable, is the earliest known example of a public water facility in the ancient world. Its purpose is uncertain: ritual bathing, storage, public recreation. The scale and careful construction suggest it was significant, but without written records that can be read, significant in what way remains open. The bricks deserve their own appreciation because they tell a story. Standard baked brick throughout the Indus Valley Civilization is produced in a ratio of 1:4, meaning if the height is 1 unit, the width is 2 and the length is 4. This ratio was consistent across hundreds of sites spanning an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, across a period of several centuries. Someone, some authority, some system, was enforcing a standard. The same standardization appears in the weights and measures found throughout the civilization. Stone weights in the shape of cubes and cylinders have been found at multiple sites, and they conform to a precise mathematical system of ratios. The smallest standard weight was approximately 0.86 grams, and the system scaled up in doubling increments from there. Merchants across thousands of kilometers of territory were using the same measurement system. This standardization is extraordinary, and it implies something that the archaeological record has not yet been able to show directly: some kind of administrative system capable of establishing and enforcing standards across an enormous geographic area. Whether this was a central government, a confederation of city-states with agreed-upon standards, a religious authority, or something else entirely is unknown. The absence of evidence for a central authority is one of the most puzzling features of the Indus Valley Civilization. Other major early civilizations are visibly hierarchical in their archaeology. Mesopotamia has its ziggurats towering over city plans, obvious centers of political and religious power. Egypt has its pyramids and temples and royal tombs stocked with the wealth of an entire civilization, concentrated in one person's burial. China has its bronze vessels and royal burials. Harappan cities have none of these markers in obvious form. There are no palaces identifiable as such, no royal burials with extraordinary concentrations of wealth, no massive temples dominating the urban landscape. There are larger structures, a possible granary at Mohenjo-Daro, a structure sometimes called the Assembly Hall, a raised platform area at several sites that might have served administrative or ritual functions, but nothing that announces itself as the seat of absolute power in the way that ancient Near Eastern palatial architecture does. What this means is debated. Some scholars argue that Harappan society was more egalitarian than its contemporaries, that power was distributed across merchant elites or civic institutions, rather than concentrated in a single ruler. Others argue that we simply haven't found the palaces yet, that the site of the political center remains undiscovered or unrecognized. Others suggest that the religious or administrative authority may have been vested in institutions that didn't manifest architecturally in the expected ways. We genuinely don't know, and the not knowing is part of what makes the Indus Valley Civilization one of the most haunting mysteries in world archaeology. The script. This is the central problem. If we could read it, we would know so much more. The Indus script, a collection of symbols found on small stone seals, on pottery, on copper tablets, and on other objects throughout the civilization's extent, consists of approximately 400 to 500 individual signs, used in sequences typically of 2 to 10 signs per inscription. It was clearly a writing system of some kind. It was used consistently enough across the civilization's extent and duration to represent a standardized communication system. It has not been deciphered. This is not for want of trying. The Indus script has attracted some of the most ambitious and some of the most dubious decipherment attempts in archaeological history. Professional scholars and enthusiastic amateurs have proposed readings connecting it to Proto-Dravidian languages, to Proto-Indo-European languages, to Sumerian, to Sanskrit, to a range of other linguistic traditions. None of these proposals has achieved scholarly consensus, and several of the most prominent ones have been fairly definitively refuted. The core problem is the absence of a bilingual text, the equivalent of the Rosetta Stone that allowed Champollion to decode Egyptian hieroglyphics. Without a text that gives you the same content in an unknown script and a known one, decipherment requires either a knowledge of the underlying language or an extremely long text with enough repetition and structural features to allow statistical analysis. The Indus texts are all short, none longer than about 26 signs in sequence, providing insufficient material for statistical approaches to work well. The underlying language might be an ancestor of the Dravidian language family, which today is represented by Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam in southern India, a possibility supported by the geographic distribution of Dravidian languages and by some features of the script structure that seem compatible with the agglutinative syntax of Dravidian. Or it might be something else entirely, a language family now extinct with no modern descendants. We cannot determine this from the available evidence. What the seals tell us without being read is still considerable. They depict animals, a bull, a unicorn that appears to be a conventionalized representation of a bovine shown in profile, a rhinoceros, a tiger, an elephant, a gharial. They depict humans in postures that appear ritual, a figure seated in what looks like a yogic posture surrounded by animals. They depict tree worship, possible ritual scenes, geometric symbols. The animal depictions are so consistently and carefully executed that they must have carried specific meaning, probably identifying the trader or institution associated with a particular seal. The seals were probably used like stamps, pressed into clay to authenticate goods or documents. They were the Harappan equivalent of a letterhead or a brand mark. The scale. The Indus Valley Civilization at its peak, roughly 2600 to 1900 BC, extended across an area of approximately 1.25 million square kilometers in what is now Pakistan, northwestern India, and extending into Afghanistan and Iran. This was larger than ancient Egypt, larger than Mesopotamia, the largest territorial extent of any Bronze Age civilization. Within this territory, archaeologists have now identified over 1,000 sites, ranging from large urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa down to small agricultural villages. With a hierarchy of settlement, sizes in between that suggests the kind of urban-rural economic integration characteristic of complex civilization. Major secondary cities have been excavated, including Dhalavira in the Rann of Kutch in India, which is remarkable for its elaborate water conservation system. The city was situated in an area with seasonal rainfall, and the inhabitants developed an extraordinary network of dams, channels, and reservoirs to capture and store monsoon water for year-round use. The engineering involved is sophisticated enough that modern water managers in the region have found it instructive. Lothal, in what is now Gujarat, appears to have had a tidal dock enabling maritime trade with Persian Gulf ports, evidence of the Indus civilization's integration into the broader ancient world trade network. Harappan goods have been found in Mesopotamian archaeological contexts, and Mesopotamian texts from the 3rd millennium BC refer to a trading partner called Meluha that is now generally identified with the Indus Valley Civilization. Carnelian beads manufactured using distinctive Harappan techniques have been found in royal burials at Ur. The Indus civilization was not isolated. It was connected to the trade networks of the ancient world and was a known, significant trading partner to the Sumerians and Akkadians of Mesopotamia. Collapse. Around 1900 BC, the Indus Valley Civilization began a change in ways that archaeologists describe as decline. The major urban centers reduced in population. The sophisticated drainage systems fell into disrepair or were not rebuilt when they deteriorated. Craft production of the high quality associated with the urban peak became less common. Long-distance trade connections attenuated. People moved eastward and southward, toward the Ganges Plain and the Indian Peninsula. What happened? The most significant recent research, published in multiple studies through the 2010s, points toward climate change as the primary driver. The Indus civilization had been sustained by the monsoon rains that made the Indus-Saraswati river system agriculturally productive. Around 4,200 years ago, paleoclimate evidence including lake sediment records, cave formations, and the study of river channel histories indicates that the South Asian monsoon weakened substantially, reducing rainfall and causing rivers to shift course or become seasonal rather than perennial. The Saraswati River system, which runs through the eastern portion of the Harappan territory, and along which some of the largest urban concentrations were located, appears to have partially dried up during this period as glacial melt that had fed it from the Himalayas reduced. The combination of reduced monsoon rainfall and the drying of river systems would have severely stressed an agricultural civilization dependent on reliable water supply. Population did not simply disappear. People moved east and south, adapting to new environments, carrying with them elements of the Harappan cultural tradition that subsequently influenced the development of later South Asian civilizations. The Gangetic Plain, which became the heartland of the Vedic civilization that eventually produced classical Hindu culture, was partly populated by people moving out of the drying Indus region. The transition from the Indus civilization to the subsequent South Asian cultural traditions is gradual and complex, not a single catastrophic collapse. But the great urban centers were abandoned, the script fell out of use, the standardized weights and measures disappeared, and the sophisticated drain and grid urban planning was not replicated. The cities waited in the ground for 4,000 years. What were they like as people? The question feels presumptuous given how little we can say with certainty. But the material record does give us something. They played games. Dice have been found at multiple Harappan sites, including the kind of cubic dice with dots on each face that would be completely recognizable to anyone who has ever played a board game. They also played with toy carts with movable wheels and with animal figurines, including small terracotta cattle and dogs and other animals that look like children's toys. They apparently had children who played, which is perhaps the most humanizing detail in the whole archaeological record. They made jewelry of extraordinary sophistication. Gold, silver, bronze, and a wide range of semi-precious stones were worked into necklaces, bangles, rings, and other ornaments. Carnelian beads were a specialty, heated and worked using techniques that required considerable craft knowledge, and were valued enough to export thousands of kilometers. They bathed regularly. The distribution of wells and bathrooms through residential areas suggests that personal hygiene was a cultural value. Every substantial house in Mohenjo-Daro appears to have had a bathroom connected to the drainage system. Whatever their religious beliefs, regular washing was evidently important enough to invest significant infrastructure in. They kept animals. Humped zebu cattle, water buffalo, sheep, goats, and possibly elephants were among the domesticated animals. They may have been among the first people to domesticate the chicken. They traded, widely and systematically. The standardized weights, the seals, the evidence of long-distance exchange all point to a society in which commerce was organized and significant. They built carefully and well. The quality of Harappan brick production and masonry is consistently noted by archaeologists. The fired bricks are dense, hard, and durable, made to dimensions that were standardized across the civilization, and laid with the kind of workmanship that reflects both skill and institutional expectation of quality. And then, over a few centuries, the cities emptied, the script went unwritten, and the world forgot they had existed. The farmer plowing a field in Harappa in the 19th century did not know he was plowing ground that had once been one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. The railway workers who carried off the bricks for ballast did not know they were dismantling a Bronze Age civilization. The world simply did not know, and then it found out. What silence teaches us. You have traveled far tonight. From the frozen harbors of Scandinavia, where shipbuilders were shaping the technology that would carry Scandinavians to 4 continents, along the dusty caravan routes of Central Asia, where merchants who spoke a dozen languages were exchanging silk and horses and ideas and pathogens and mathematical concepts, down into the ground at Mohenjo-Daro, where beneath the ruined streets the drainage channels still run in the dark, waiting. These stories share something. They share silence in different forms. The silence of the Norse sagas that recorded their stories in Iceland, and were then dismissed as legend, until a fisherman's tip led archaeologists to the foundations of a Norse building in Newfoundland, and the legend became history. The silence of the Silk Road, which operated for 15 centuries at the center of the ancient world, and is now remembered primarily as a romantic metaphor for global trade. Its actual complexity and brutality and daily human reality reduced to a decorative image. The silence of the Indus Valley script, 400 to 500 symbols carved on thousands of seals and tablets, a writing system used across an area larger than Egypt, that no living person can read. History is full of silences like these, full of things that happened and left marks and were then covered by time, by sand, by the disinterest of those who came after, by the deliberate erasure of conquerors, by the accidents of what survives and what doesn't. Every silence we encounter in the historical record is evidence of a story we haven't heard yet, not evidence of an absence of story. The Harappan people had names for each other. They had words for love and anger and grief and jokes, and the specific smell of rain on dry ground, which is, incidentally, a smell for which English only got a word in 1964, petrichor, though the experience had been noticed and described in Sanskrit literature as the fragrance of the earth for centuries. They had disagreements and celebrations and fears that kept them awake and moments of beauty that stopped them in their tracks. We don't have the record, but they were there. The drains beneath Mohenjo-Daro, still following the streets in the dark, are the record of their presence. The colossal heads in the Mexican jungle, the jade mask on Tutankhamun's face, the letters never delivered from a Sogdian merchant's wife in Dunhuang, the Norse longship replica in the Oslo Museum that still cuts through water with a grace its builders would recognize, the Code of Napoleon still governing the legal transactions of 100 million people. These are not relics. They are presences. The past is not over. It is simply less visible than the present. Lean in close enough and you can hear it. Tonight, in your clean room with your central heating and your running water and your access to every piece of human knowledge in the electronic glow of your phone, you are sitting on top of 15,000 years of people who tried to make something that would last. Some of what they built is still here. Most of it is not, but they were here. Every single one of them. And so are you. Sleep well.